Well, good morning. I'll just wait a minute or so longer just to see if we have any. Oh, good. We picking up some other people. As always, we have a lot of people that cannot listen at 9, so they tend to listen later on. And so, uh, thank you for joining us this morning. It's good to see all of you here. And I just want to encourage everybody to share this as you can. Um, I, I honestly believe that of all the books that we can be reading in our time, that the Great Divorce and the Screw Tape Letters are among the most important books that we could be reading and comprehending and applying um, his insight into human nature, our spirituality, culture, the implications of uh, what our culture does now and how it impacts the future are beyond phenomenal. He's often regarded as um, a postmodern prophet, just because of his ability to see deep into the future. And I'm not even sure he understood what it was that he was saying and how it would apply to our time today. And I think as you read the Screw Tape related to human nature, sin, uh, and how our world, the culture that we live in, speak and inform and shape all of that. So last week, and moving on to the Great Divorce, last week I spent all of my time on the preface. And as with most Lewis and books, you should always spend time on the introduction or the preface. I think that it helps to set the stage in a really powerful way. So, one of the primary themes that we talked about last week regarding the preface has to do with this observation that Lewis makes, which I think has some tremendous merit to it. And basically, he says this in the preface. Uh, he said that for those people who come to faith in Christ here on earth, that when they live their life and grow in their faith, die and enter into heaven with all of its glory and wonder and beauty and power and joy, that when they look back over the course of their life, um, it will seem as if they have always been in heaven to a certain degree, that because while on earth they were participating in the things of God, that they were participating in some of the things of heaven as they could. And so as they grew in their faith, they incorporated more of the things of God, more of the things in heaven into their life. And so which was culminated in heaven. So there's a certain sense in which heaven works backwards for the Christian through the totality of their life. And then he says, for those people who never come to faith, but end up in hell, that when they look back from the entry to hell to the whole of their life, that because they never participated in the things of God, but only participated largely in hellish things, deceived, living their lives out in that kind of a way, deepening their sinful nature until it was culminated in hell itself, that it will appear as if they had always been in hell because they had always been participating in the things of hell the whole of their. Get that thought out and considering helpful. We come then to this first chapter in the Great Divorce, and in this chapter, uh, the main character um, is in this that Lewis would describe as, oh, it does not have the kind of description where where there's fire and a lake of fire and all that kind of a thing. This is maybe in Lewis's fictional account. So he's very careful to say in the preface that he's not trying to, in any overt way, describe uh, the essence of heaven and the essence of hell itself. This is a fictional account. Nonetheless, even as a fictional account, I think he provides some deep insights about certain things regarding the differences between those two places. In any case, this character finds himself, and there's no prequel, there's no it just you just sort of into him beginning to reminisce about where he is and what's going on. So and so that's where we are. So he says, I seem to be standing on a busy queue, which is a platform, a place where people gather to get on a bus train street. Evening was just closing in, and it was raining. Now, note here that it's not quite dark, it's dusk. Evening is closing in. When you get into the later chapters, it's not quite morning, it's always dawn, just before morning. So I think that there are these juxtapositions here that Lewis is intentionally working in. So it's almost evening, it's dusk. I seemed to be standing in a busy queue by the side of a long, mean street. Evening was just closing in, and it was raining. I had been wandering for hours in similar mean streets, always in the rain, always in evening twilight. Time seemed to have paused on that dismal moment when only a few shops have lit up, and not yet dark for their windows to look cheering. And just as the evening never advanced to night, so my walking had never brought me to the better parts of town, because there are no better parts of town. However far I went, I found only dingy lodging houses, small tobacconists' hoardings from their posters, which hung in rags, and windowless warehouses, goods stations without trains, and bookshops of the sort that sell the works of Aristotle. This is just, I love how Lewis works these kinds of things in. As some of you know, Aristotle was one of the three great classical Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Aristotle studied Plato and and taught Plato, but kind of took some of the things that Plato taught. So Plato, and I don't want to go too far off into the weeds here, but it's helpful to understand this. Plato, of the many things that he taught, Plato talked about how about a thing called the world of the forms. So for Plato, in heaven, there were these things called forms, which were perfect representations. So they were divine. And so you would go there if you wanted to see a perfect anything, you would go to heaven and you would see the perfect dog, the perfect horse, the perfect chair. It all existed in heaven. Aristotle taught that if you really wanted to know anything, that you had to study things as they were here, and that to know their true nature and what they really ought to be, that you had to study them with your senses. So there's a certain sense in which Aristotle was the father of what we call empiricism. And empiricism says that all knowledge is derived from sensory experience. There really isn't any room for the divine. There's no knowledge. There's no inspiration. There's no illumination to be gained from the metaphysical world, the world where heaven is, the world where angels are. So all knowledge, according to Aristotle, should be derived from the sensory experience, and we call this empiricism. Actually, in many respects, you probably could find the rootedness of scientism, much of the Enlightenment through Aristotle, which, by the way, Aristotle's works disappeared for probably 1,500 years, and they were only rediscovered during the Crusades. And the Crusaders, when they plundered certain cities, would bring back things from those cities. And one of the things that they brought back were the the ancient works of Aristotle. And the Crusaders brought them to Rome, and the scholars in Rome began to study him. And it was during that time that we had what was called the rise of the university, right? And so Europe began to experience. That's when Europe became started to emerge from the Dark Ages, and one of the elements of that was the rise of the university. And in the university experience were the studies of Aristotle and his empiricism, and so one of the primary people you may have heard of was a guy named Thomas Aquinas, who was heavily influenced by the works of Aristotle, and used the works of Aristotle, at least some of his teachings, in his apologetics, which he's well known for, the defense of God. So Lewis includes Aristotle in this chapter, kind of, I think, it's a swipe of sorts, but he includes Aristotle because it's Lewis's critique for those who would only use their sensory experience for understanding, for knowing, for deciding that all that there is to know is can only be known through the sensory experience. There's no room for faith. There's no room for trust. There's no room for hope. In many respects, there's no room for the metaphysical world in which, of course, God lives. So that's kind of what's going on in his use of the works of Aristotle. So he goes on to say, I never met anyone, but for the little crowd at the bus stop. The whole town seemed to be empty. I think it was why, for just as I took my stand, a little waspish woman, whom would have been ahead of, snapped out at a man who's to be with her. Very well, then, I won't go at all, so there, and left the queue. Pray, don't imagine, said the man in a very dignified voice, that I care about going in the least. I've only been trying to please you for peace sake. My own feelings are, of course, of no importance. I quite understand that. And suiting the action to the word, he also walked away. Come, thought I, that's 2 places gained. I was now next to a very short man with a scowl, who glanced at me with an expression of extreme disfavor, and observed rather unnecessarily loudly to the man beyond him, quote, this sort of thing really makes one think twice about going at all. What sort of thing? Growled the other, a big, beefy person. Well, short man, this is hardly the sort of society I am used to. As a matter of fact, said the big man, and then added with a glance at me, Don't you stand any sauce from him, miss. He suddenly on the short said, not good enough for you, are we? Like your lip. Next moment, he had fetched the short man, one on the face of the big man to no one in particular. I am a plain man, that's what I am. I've got rights, same anyone else. See? As the man showed no disposition to rejoin the queue and soon began limping away, I closed up rather cautiously behind the big man and congratulated myself for having gained yet another step. A moment later, two young people in front of him also left us arm in arm. This is written, I want to say this is written in the early 1940s. So it's, I mean, it's just amazing. 1946. It's just amazing. So a moment later, two young men in front of me also left us arm in arm. They were both so trousered, slender, giggly, and falsetto that I could be sure of the sex of neither. But it was clear that each for the moment preferred the other to the chance of a place in the bus. Who would have thought that Lewis would have observed that kind of a thing back in the 1946s, which was so much more conservative, and yet that description you could use today, exactly today, 70 years later. We shall never all get in, said the female voice with a whine in it from some 4 places ahead of me. Change places with you for 5 bob, lady, said someone else. I heard the clink of money, and then a scream in the female voice mixed with roars of laughter from the rest of the crowd. The cheated woman leaped out of her place to fly at the man who bilked her, but the immediately closed up and flung her out. So you can begin to see that this is a group of people that they're selfish. They take advantage of each other. So it's just not a nice crowd. They they uh, they aren't very ethical or very moral. So what with the one thing and the other, the queue had reduced itself to manageable proportions long before the bus arrived. It was a wonderful vehicle, blazing with golden light, heretically colored. The driver, this is all in caps, himself seemed of light, and he used only one hand to drive with. The other he waved before his face as if to fan away the greasy steam of the rain. A growl went up from the queue as he came in sight. Looks as if he had a good time of it, eh? Bloody pleased with himself, I bet. My dear, why can't he behave naturally? Thinks himself too good to look at us. So, I don't know if this person is an angel or the Holy Spirit, but in any case, in this fictional account, uh, this is clearly somebody who is not like anybody else in this place, and who has divine qualities about them. Who does he imagine he is? All that gilding and purple. I call it a wicked waste. Why don't they spend some of the money on their own house property down here? God, I'd like to give him one in the old ear. I could see nothing in the countenance of the driver to justify all this, unless it were that he had a look of authority and seemed intent on carrying out his job. And so not only are they not kind to each other, but they have, a poisonous tongue. So very judgmental, um, and arrogant. My fellow passengers fought like hens to get on board the bus, though there was plenty of room for all of us. I was the last to get in. The bus was only half full, and I selected a seat in the back, well away from the others. But a tousled haired youth at once came and sat down beside me. As he did so, we moved off. And so here we have this foreboding place these people live in, cheerless, seems to be rather miserable. And for some reason, they're collecting on this queue, waiting to be whisked away by something. Along comes this bus, illuminate, brilliant, driven by this angelic uh, figure who is picking them up. Um, and, instead of being cheerful and happy and excited about it, they fight, they and so this is just not a very nice crowd at all, despite the fact that their fortunes seem to have improved by getting on this bus, which was infinitely much more pleasant than the place that they were currently in. So the main character then goes away from the rest of the crowd to be by himself, and so this other person, this tousled haired uh, young person, comes and sits right next to him. And so now we're going to begin to see a little more in depth the different kinds of people who ended up in this place, this gray town, this what I would consider to be the outer perimeter of hell itself, as Lewis describes it. Again, this is a fictional thing. He's simply creating a context. He's not trying to say anything overtly in this way, because you and I know that hell is that place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so this description that Lewis gives doesn't dismiss that. It just doesn't involve that. Okay. So this is what the tousled-haired youth. I thought you would mind my tacking on to you, he said, for I've noticed that you feel just as I do about the present company. Why on earth they insist on coming, I can't imagine. They won't like it at all when we get there, and they'd really be much more comfortable at home. It's different for you and me. Do they like this place? I asked. As much as they like anything, he answered. They've got cinemas and fish and chip shops and advertisements and all the sorts of things they want. The appalling lack of any intellectual life doesn't worry them. I realized as soon as I got here that there had been some mistake. I ought to have been taken I ought to have taken the first bus. But I fooled trying to wake people up here. I found a few fellows I had known before and tried to form a little circle, but they all seemed to have sunk even before I came here. Poet. I had doubts about a man like Cyril Blellow. Cyril Blellow at that time would have been a cultural elite who represented, in many respects, the literary figures, the poets, the novelists, the journalists of his day. So this guy is saying, I had some doubt about this guy named Cyril Blellow, the cultural elite of his time, who would have been a progressive in our time, who a part of the mainstream media establishment like CNN and the LA Times, places like that, elite places where we get our news and information. So even before we came here, I had some doubts about a man like Cyril Blellow. I always thought he was working a false idiom, but he was at least intelligent. One could get some criticism worth hearing from him, even if he was a failure on the creative side. But now he seems to have nothing left but his self-conceit. The last time I tried to read him some of my own stuff, but wait a minute, I just like you to look at it. So he's talking about this guy named Blellow. He wanted Blellow to read some of his own literature, and he interrupts himself and now says to the main character, I would like for you to read some of my own stuff. Realizing with a shudder that what he was producing from his pocket was a thick wad of typewritten paper, I muttered something about not having my spectacles and exclaimed, "Hello, we've left the ground." It was true. Several hundred feet below us, already half hidden in the rain and mist, far I could reach. So this town is enormous, huge, cheerless, dismal, on and on and on, as far as the eye could reach. So that's that's the main character being in this town that I like to call Greytown. Maybe some of you remember Michael W. Smith's song Greytown. It was a long time ago, so I'm dating myself. Uh, but this is the nature of the town, nature of the people, and now mysteriously this bus shows up that is representative of heaven itself, that looks like it's from heaven. Now the main person who is a tousled-haired poet, and so that's what he's about. So now we're going to go on to chapter 2, because I think that there's much more to be said in chapter 2. So I hope that you'll stay with me on that, and I will try and get through within the next half hour or so. All right. So he says. So he goes on to say, "I was not left very long at the mercy of the tassel-headed poet, because another passenger interrupted our conversation. But before that happened, I had learned a good deal about him. He appeared to be singularly an ill-used man. His parents had never appreciated him, and none of the 5 schools at which he had been educated seemed to have made any provision for a talent and temperament such as his." Do you do you see the connection here between how he describes this guy and what we see going on in higher education? It's just stunning, really. His parents had never appreciated him, and none of the 5 schools at which he had been educated seemed to have made any provision for his talent and temperament such as his. So the school is supposed to change what he wanted. To make matters worse, he'd been exactly the sort of boy in whose case the examination system works out with the maximum unfairness and absurdity. Imagine that. The school examining him. The school, in other words, the school was biased in how they did their testing to measure what it was that he knew and how intelligent he was. Sound familiar? It was not until he reached the university that he recognized that all of these inevitable results of our economic system. Capitalism didn't merely enslave the workers, it also vitiated. So the word vitiated means to impair, spoil, debase, to make useless. Capitalism did not merely enslave the workers, it also vitiated taste and vulgarized intellect, hence our educational system, and hence the lack of recognition. This could have been written today. It's just stunning how relevant what he is saying overlaps what we are seeing in higher education today. And hence the lack of recognition for new genius. This discovery had made him a communist. But when the war came along, Second World War, and he saw Russia in alliance with capitalist governments, he had found himself once more isolated and had to become a conscientious objector. The indignation, he confessed, embittered him. He decided he could serve the cause best by going to America. But then America came into the war too. It was at this point that he suddenly saw Sweden as the home of a really new and radical art. But the various oppressors had given him no facilities for going to Sweden. There were money troubles. His father, who had never progressed beyond the most atrocious mental complacency and the smugness of the Victorian epoch, was giving him a ludicrously inadequate allowance. And he had been very badly treated by a girl, too. He had thought her a really civilized and adult personality, and then she unexpectedly revealed that she was a mass of bourgeoisie prejudices and monogamic instincts. In other words, she wanted to get married. Jealousy, possessive, a quality he particularly disliked. She had ever shown her at the end to be about money. That was the last straw. He jumped under a train. So Lewis paints this guy, and you can the main character through Lewis, how Lewis through the main character describes this guy as a young, disillusioned communist who feels victimized by his family, victimized by his school, victimized by his culture, and stunned that in his relationship with this girl that she actually wanted some kind of permanent arrangement in terms of marriage and children and all that kind of stuff. And so he couldn't take it anymore, and so he killed himself. I think we call these people snowflakes in our time today. I gave a start, but he took no notice. He continued. Ill luck had continued to dog him. He had been sent to the Grey Town. But of course, it was a mistake. I would find, he assured me, that all the other passengers would be with me on the return journey. But he would not. He was going to stay there. He felt quite certain that he was going where, at last, his finely critical spirit no longer be outraged, the uncongenial environment where he would find recognition and appreciation. Meanwhile, since I hadn't got my glasses, he would read me the passage about which Cyril Blello had been so insensitive. And so here's a guy that is self-absorbed, self-interested, narcissistic, and so this is the reason why he ended up in Greytown, and he believed that he would remain where the button, but that the main character and everybody else would come back, and he would remain there because wherever that there is, and we will know it to be heaven, they will appreciate him, they will respect him, they will affirm everything that he is, and so that's why he will end up there. He goes on to say, it was just then that we were interrupted. One of the quarrels, which were perpetually simmering on the bus, had boiled over, and for a moment there was a stampede. Knives were drawn, pistols were fired, but it looked strangely innocuous. And when it was over, myself unarmed, though in a different seat, and with a new companion. So now we meet the second type of person that Lewis is describing through this main character. It's an intelligent looking man who's in a bowler hat. I looked out the window. I did not see. Impression that the Greytown was still filled, the whole field of vision. So it was just incredibly massive, this Greytown. It seems the deuce of a town, I volunteered, and that's what I can't understand. The parts of it I saw were so empty. Was there a much larger population? So, I think I want to just stop there for a minute. And there's a biblical text that might be helpful when it comes to describing the size of hell. And I think I have a text here that might be helpful. So let's say Psalm 9, verse 13. Well, maybe we'll talk about it more, but here, yeah. So sorry to get distracted here, but if I can find it, I'll come back to it later. But it seems the deuce of a town, I volunteered, and that's what I can't understand. The parts of it that I saw were so empty. Was there a much larger population? This is a fascinating part here. Settles in some street. He's quarreled so badly that he decides to move. Very likely he finds the next street empty because all the people there have quarreled with their neighbors and moved. If so, he settles in. If by any chance the street goes full, he goes further. But even if he stays, it makes no odds. He's sure to have another quarrel pretty soon, and then he'll move on again. Finally, he'll move right out to the edge of town and build a new house. You see, it's easy here. You only have to think a house, and there it is. That's how the town keeps on growing, leaving more and more empty streets. So, and so, the picture here is that this enormous town is is built and somewhat filled by people who just can't get along with each other on any level. They just quarrel, they just fight, they just bicker all the time, much like what we saw on the queue for the bus station, and much like what we saw in the bus itself. This is a place, hell is a place where no one gets along. Everybody is at odds. Everybody wants what they want. No one is concerned about what anybody else wants. And so there's zero community, zero in any kind of a way. So he goes on to say, that's right. And time's sort of odd there. That place where we caught the bus is thousands of miles from the Civic Center, where all newcomers arrive from Earth. All the people you've met were living near the bus stop, but they had taken centuries of our time to get there by gradual removals. So Lewis is painting this picture through this main character about time and space, and about how much time it takes for anyone to occupy that space, to move in that space. And this is very intentional here. So more of it will come to light as we read further, but this is a really important concept for appreciating this book. That's right, and time's sort of odd here. That place where we caught the bus is thousands of miles from the Civic Center, where all the newcomers arrive from Earth. All the people you've met were living near the bus stop, but they'd taken centuries of our time to get there by gradual removals. And what about the earlier arrivals? I mean, there must be people who came from Earth to your town even longer ago. That's right, there are. They've been moving on and on, getting further apart. They're so far off by now, they could never think of coming to the bus stop at all. So, if any of you read Dante, it would seem to me that and Lewis would have read Dante since he was a, a professor of literature and the great classics. So Dante's Inferno talks about the different levels of hell. And the truly evil, truly wicked people end up at the very bottom of hell, and then there's certain levels. So that's Dante's take. We want to be careful we don't read too much into that, but I think that Lewis is kind of borrowing a little bit from Dante's Inferno here. So he goes on to say, that's right, they've been moving on, getting further apart. They're so far off by now that they could never think of coming to the bus stop at all. Astronomical distances. There's a bit of rising ground where I live, and a chap has a telescope. You can see the lights of the inhabited houses where those old ones live, millions of miles away, millions of miles from us and from one another. Every now and then, they move further still. That's one of the disappointments. I thought you'd meet interesting historical characters, but you don't. They're too far away. So, hell then is this place so vast that whoever ends up that of the millions and millions and maybe trillions of people who end up in hell, they still live thousands of miles from each other, and it continues to expand and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so let me just get back to this. You meet interesting figures, but you away. Would they get to the bus stop in time if they ever set out? Well, theoretically, but it'd be a distance of light years.